Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ritika Patil, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all to another edition of the ICCA panel discussion titled 19th Russia-India-China Trilateral Academic Conference 2020. The 19th Russia-India-China Trilateral Academic Conference was held in Moscow from October 7 to 9, 2024. These academic exchanges, initiated in Moscow in September 2001, bring together scholars from the Institute of China and Contemporary Asia of the Russian Academy of Sciences, the China Institute of International Studies in Beijing, and the Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi. Supported by the governments of the three countries, the conferences are held annually on a rotational basis in each of the three capitals. The 19th conference followed its established format of scholarly discussions addressing global, regional, and bilateral dynamics. It featured four sessions focusing on the global cooperation agenda within the RIC framework, regional trilateral interactions, and opportunities for collaboration in practical areas such as energy and hydrocarbons and IT technologies. This seminar seeks to highlight the insights and perspectives of the five ICES representatives regarding the opportunities and challenges facing the RIC mechanism amid a highly volatile and turbulent global environment. The panelists for today's seminar are Professor Anuradha Chennar, Dr. Jabin T. Jacob, and Dr. Arvind Yellery. Unfortunately, due to unavoidable circumstances, Lieutenant General S.N. Narasimhan won't be joining us today. Professor Chennar is an adjunct professor at Jindal Global University and former professor and dean at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Dr. Jabin T. Jacob is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and Government Studies and director the Center for Himalayan Studies, Shivnagar University, Delhi National Capital Region. Dr. Arvind Kellery is an associate professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and an honorary fellow at the ICCA. The moderator and panelist for today's discussion is Professor Alka Achar. She is the honorary director at the ICS and professor and chairperson at the Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Professor Acharya. Thank you.
Thanks, Ritika. Such a long panel. We had to spend this kind of time on the introductions. Now, as she said, that one member of the panel, General S.L. Narasimhan, who was also a member of this delegation, has been unavoidably diverted from his usual route. So he's not going to be able to join us. So what I have requested my fellow panelists is to, and in fact, Jabin will be coming in with a sense of the session that General Narasimhan had participated in and give you a brief gist of the nature of the discussions and the kind of assessments of that particular session. So let me just begin by, since not everybody here may be familiar with this idea of the RIC, Trilateral Academic Conference. Let me just begin by a very short introduction. These trilateral academic, and we stress the word academic conferences, had actually commenced in Moscow in September 2001. And they involved scholars from the Institute of Far Eastern Studies, the IFES, and the Russian Academy of Sciences. That has now been created in a new avatar, which is the Institute for China and Contemporary Asia, ICCA, but located within the Russian Academy of Sciences. And the China Institute of International Studies from Beijing, which is obviously the Ministry of Foreign Affairs think tank, and the Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi. As I said, they commenced in 2001, and at the time of their commencement, we were having a very close synergy with the track one level, as it were. The governments of all the three countries supported this initiative, supported it as a useful platform for scholars from all three countries to come together and take stock of situation, the world scenario, regional dynamics, bilateral relations, and essentially see what were the areas of convergences and divergences that emerged in these discussions. It was agreed that this conference would take place annually in each of the three capitals by rotation. The last online conference that took place was in Beijing, which was offline conference took place in Beijing in 2019. We were hit by the pandemic. 2020, there was a gap. That was year when everything went haywire. So by the time we got everything sorted out, we had the first online conference organized by the Institute of Chinese Studies in 2021. 2022 and 2023 saw further kind of upheavals, and there was a gap of 2 years. So this conference in Moscow from 7th to 9th October was the first offline conference since 2019. And it followed the format that is been the practice of all the 19 conferences so far. In fact, somebody remarked that while this would be the Moscow was the 19th conference, actually next year we will have put a quarter of a century behind us in terms of the engagements between the three scholars. Now, as I said, that to begin with, this was an initiative that was very strongly supported by the governments. And 2 years after the Academic Scholars Conference started, actually track one got inaugurated, track one in the Russia, India, China conferences. And thereafter, track 1 and 2 went in tandem. Invariably, track 2 took place before the track 1 happened in any year. And that then became a very useful mechanism by which the recommendations and the assessments of the scholars of the potentials and the possibilities were transmitted to the track 1 levels. And I remember that at the ICCA we were pretty happy about the fact that the track 1 level had actually taken cognizance of track 2 exercises and appreciated the kind of inputs that came out of these conferences. Now, the format, as I said, has been fairly steady. It has had kind of 3 sections within the conference. The first section is devoted to a discussion on the assessments about the nature of IR, nature of the problems and the challenges that are confronting world community, and the way in which the 3 sides assess these challenges at the global level. The second session looks at regional dynamics, and again, which are the regional hotspots, which are the areas where all the 3 scholars from all 3 countries can examine the nature of these regional developments. Where are the areas where we can think in terms of opening up possibilities of cooperation, and obviously the limitations therein. The last session invariably is devoted to a closer look at the bilateral kind of state of affairs. and the recognition that obviously there is a close connection between the overall health of the bilateral relationship and its impact, therefore, on any potential for a trilateral kind of an initiative. This has been invariably the format. What changes, however, are the kind of issues or the themes that get woven into these three dynamics, three levels of analysis. Now, a quick 2 minutes to just give you a sense of the evolution of this trilateral conferences. That 2001, when they commenced, the delegation from the ICCA was led by Ambassador C.V. Ranganathan, who is emeritus fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies, but it gives you a sense of the synergy between track 1 and track 2, because these delegations have always comprised former practitioners, scholars, and sometimes professionals. More often the case, we have taken professionals, particularly in the fields of science and technology or functional areas where we think China, Russia, India can have cooperation. So, and I do remember the very first opening statement by Ambassador Ranganathan in the very first conference was that the RIC, he said the RIC was an idea whose time had come. Now, obviously, the idea, whether it has come or not, has been open to debate over the past 2 decades. Many people have expressed healthy skepticism. Many people don't believe it can amount to anything. But the fact that there is a platform where you have 3 countries like Russia, India, and China, who invariably, this is mentioned over and over again, that this is a platform which brings together 1/5 of humanity. It brings together some of the largest territorial spaces. It brings together countries which are, one is a rising power, another is, of course, another rising power, and so on. So in other words, that this is a bloc which is, for historical, cultural, civilizational, economic, political reasons, a factor to be reckoned with. And when they three when these three come together, then clearly there can be some very useful exchanges. The first decade, we were basically explored commonalities, and we found that over the first decade since 2001, there were spaces opening up for cooperation. And in fact, track 1 actually took this, set up 2 further initiatives to take forward cooperation, particularly in the area of agriculture, agricultural development, and newer non-military areas of cooperation, cooperating in spaces like natural disasters or health and education issues. So, point I'm trying to make here is that when you start to unpack areas for cooperation which move to levels below, let's say, the strategic or the political, we find that there were a large number of areas, given the fact that the human developmental concerns were fairly common to all 3 countries in the first decade of the 21st century. And so from a time when the convergences were multiplying far more rapidly, we have, over a period of 2 decades, come to a point when we actually were wondering whether the divergences were becoming now much more marked than the commonalities. And this had, in a large measure, to do with the fact that the relationship between the 3 countries, in other words, bilateral dynamics between the 3 countries, had become very drastically changed and transformed over this last 1 decade. So, so this has been the broad shift in terms of the nature of the trilateral exercise. And one final word about what was really the core objective of this trilateral academic exercise. One was that this would be about taking the trends towards multipolarity forward. That from the time that the bipolar world order had come to an end and the new order had not yet taken shape, but was clearly in the interests of all three countries and broadly the developing world generally, that multipolarity should be something that should be supported and pushed, and more broader platform should be generated to talk about the transformation, the structural transformation of international relations. Secondly, that as we were moving towards a different kind of an order, a new kind of a rules-based order, if you will, three countries like India, China, and Russia should play a much bigger role in the shaping of the new norms and new rules that would underpin this new order. And finally, it was also very clear to scholars from all three sides that this dialogue and this exchange should in no way be looked at in terms of an alliance or in any sense directed against anybody or any specific country. So this was clearly the three no's as they were known as underpinned the rationale of this exercise. Now, I will briefly give you a sense of what the points I had made in the, no, or maybe I'll come in later because technically my session comes at the end. So I'll just stop here by requesting now the next speaker, which would be Anu, to come in and give a sense of this first session. And then I'll come in towards the end to do a little summary.
Thank you, Alka, and thank you, ICS, of course, first for making me part of the delegation of this very interesting conference, and second for holding this review, in a sense, and a dialogue on what transpired. And I think Alka already put it very clearly that the intent was to continue a discussion between academics dedicated towards discussing all issues without inhibitions, looking at the challenges, looking at what is possible, and hopefully feeding it not only for shaping a discourse, no one can take entire credit for that, but for adding to the discourse and also adding to the track one, if that's possible, if that is possible. And so the conference was held in that very kind of healthy environment of dialogue and discussion. I think the arguments I made, I'll just put it very quickly because it was amongst the first presentations in the conference. And I had structured my paper as the common, looking at the common interests of the three, the common strategies, as well as then the challenges. And the common interests were, of course, as one was, all three are very vested in multipolarity as a global redistribution of power, of showing that there's no going back from this multipolarity, and that what this multipolarity means is essentially about international pluralism. It challenges any specific singular narrative, without saying that no to anyone, but wanting accommodation and plurality. So it's not against any power, but Of course, it wants the voices of the global south, but it also says that the multiple voices of emerging powers like the RIC and others should be part of the international discourse, and similarly supporting a kind of a democratizing the financial system. For instance, use of local currencies, etc., issues of debt, and doing all this through a very peaceful way. And the strategy, therefore, which all three shared, was the fact that BRICS developed and has got increasingly institutionalized and popularized, as you can see in the New Development Bank, etc. And BRICS does not want to be exclusionary, but inclusionary. And of course, the challenges were the most serious ones, and that was, we did, and I also did in my paper, talk about the unresolved bilateral tensions, and talked about any superpower fusing itself into any regional or bilateral tensions. And therefore making a local or a regional tension or a bilateral tension into an international tension. So that was an issue. And the last point in that was a need for a common future of moving BRICS and multipolarity forward, increasing and having reforms in multilateralism, in the multilateral institutions, and having a more peaceful, non-hegemonic and international and regional voice, where regional voices can come up, and expanding and institutionalizing BRICS. So that was as far as the broad theoretical paradigm was concerned. And I just want to tell about what my impressions were of the three sides. Now, I had got the impression that the Russians were extremely keen that RIC actually go forward, and the issues, RIC going forward meant that the issues between India and China, be resolved in a way that can facilitate RIC. And they also made it very clear that they were not going to be the facilitator, or it has to be between the two, but they would be interested in this kind of, if this bilateral dialogue between the two went forward. That was as far as the Russians was concerned. The Chinese side, interestingly, I felt they had a very high-powered delegation led by one former ambassador to Brussels, Ambassador Chen Bo. And their argument was very similar to what the Chinese official position has been. And that is, despite any unresolved bilateral issues, like let's say on the border, for example, India and China should go ahead with trade. Already the trade has increased significantly. And that India, move away from the concerns on the border and concentrate then with the Chinese on, let's say, bilateral exchanges, more trade, more visas, more direct flights between the two. So, put the problems on the back burner and move ahead. Now, this was quite contrary to our position. While we are independent of, and we don't have state positions, but nonetheless, we had a common position that to improve the Indian and Chinese relation, the Sino-Indian relationship, we cannot put anything on the back burner. And that the relationships which had significantly suddenly deteriorated after 2020, considering that they were either in a status quo or improved somewhat till 2018 or so, we didn't want that to be on the back burner, but also to be addressed. And we were pretty supportive, as of the fact that there had been this commander level talks which have been ongoing. But we did say that on some issues, like let's say on solar power and gaining, sharing some technological insights between the two, one should go forward. So these were broadly the three positions. And my conclusion now is, interestingly, that exactly a few weeks later, there has been some, I felt, I don't know, I would like to hear about these views from the others. I felt that this resolution, not really resolution, but at least some steps towards disengagement on key points has been very significant. This really kind of points to the fact that some of the things that the Chinese and the Indians are saying, both the Indian side saying that this needs to be resolved before we move on to others, and what the Chinese said that, let's broaden the issues, both seem to be coming through after this recent disengagement. And just 2 days ago, our External Affairs Minister has said that the disengagement is somewhat complete. Of course, other steps remain, however they would like it. So I see this quite positively, and therefore I felt that this RIC meeting was a very positive engagement. So that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Anu. I think that was a good sense of the differences between the three sides. I think the chief issues that you brought out of difference clearly spilled out into other arenas as well. But let me then now ask Jabin to come in with his sense. He was part of the session which dealt with regional dynamics, and then he'll also bring in the next session, which was on science and tech and area of cooperation as an emerging area of cooperation. So, yep, Jabin.
Yeah, thank you. As Professor Acharya mentioned, there are both people who see value in this forum, and she said those with a healthy skepticism. I count myself among the latter category. In fact, I have more than just skepticism as far as the RIC is concerned, but given that, as Professor Acharya mentioned, that this meeting was taking place for the first time offline in in-person mode since 2019, I thought this was a pretty interesting forum. Much, of course, has happened in that time between 2019 and 2024. The pandemic, of course, Chinese transgressions on the LAC, changes in US administration from Donald Trump to Joe Biden, and now, we are clearly there was the overhang of what if Trump comes back, at the RIC. Then, of course, we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as the weakening of the Chinese economy. So I think there's a certain regional and global context that explains the revival of the RIC format, even if only in the track 1.5 version at this particular time, right? So, India's own lack of adequate economic growth in the last few years, the need for foreign investments and technology to drive its growth, that it is not actually getting from the West. The Chinese search for alternative markets in the face of economic pressures from the US and the rest of the West, and of course, a shared concern over implications of the return of Trump to power. So, as I think, Professor Anuradha Chinoy just pointed out, there seemed to be an understanding that things needed to be mended, which drove encouragement. Certainly, we saw that encouragement certainly on our side from the government to, okay, go ahead and be part of this sort of an engagement with the Chinese and the Russians, even though historically, the Indian government has not really been a big fan of the RIC itself. I mean, it has preferred to do that at the track 1 level, but track 1.5, it's not, or track 2. I mean, essentially speaking, at the Indian level, it's track 2. It is track 1.5 at the on the Russian and the Chinese sides. So this is not something that the Indian government has particularly encouraged. But right now, we did see encouragement precisely, I think, because of this current regional and global situation. Now, what I'm going to do is try and bring together the points from both my session as well as General Narasimhan's session, as well as sort of give you a bit of what I responded to also, during the session. Now, in terms of Russian agenda, I mean, let me start with some broad points, and it might I support some of what Professor Chinoy was just mentioning. The Russians seem to drive the revival of the RIC as host this time for several reasons. The conflict with Ukraine, I think there's a sense of increased dependence on the Chinese, which meant that they had to recover some ground at the regional level by engaging with RIC, promoting BRICS, and so on. The Chinese and the Russians seem to have slightly different approaches to what security architecture should be in the Eurasian format, in the Eurasian context. But the Russians are very keen on this. And the Russians, as was pointed out, the Russians were very keen on India-China rapprochement. Repeatedly, they kept referring to their own example with during the Soviet, Sino-Soviet split, and how they got over that split as an example of how India and China could resolve their issues. Now, I don't think that the Russians were ignorant of the specificities of the India-China situation. It's just that they needed India and China working together, as well as on the Russian side, in order to handle their own pressures from the West. So the Russians seem to be interested in conveying an impression that they were still that they still mattered. That they were not completely stuck with the Chinese, but had multiple friends and partners of global weight and standing. And so, like the Chinese, the Russians also seem to worry a little bit about, or quite a bit, in fact, about the growing India-US relationship, and were keen, I think, to find ways to remind India or the delegation that, it is useful and important to be skeptical of the United States. Now, where the Russians and the Chinese worked in tandem, I thought, were in their putting forward of so-called practical ideas of cooperation. The financial sector has already been mentioned. SWIFT, SEEPS, the Chinese sort of counter to SWIFT, and so on. The Chinese and the Russians both, of course, promoted the idea of a more expanded multilateral engagement through BRICS and so on. And you saw that there was a new financial architecture proposed again at the BRICS forum. Now, in terms of science and technology cooperation, which is a area where General Narasimhan spoke, I think it's quite interesting how General Narasimhan pointed out. I mean, his stress was really on what was actually happening, and what was happening, or what has happened, is really very strong India-Russia cooperation in the science and tech. But if you look at India-China cooperation in science and tech, I mean, it's hardly ever been there. And this is the situation even before. He calls it, it was in retrograde mode even before the boundary issue cropped up again in 2020. And he points out that the important thing is to be building on agreed initiatives. And here I want to point out, Professor Acharya also referred to, all these ideas for green technology, green cooperation, and so on that have been coming up. And it's actually not an emerging area. If anything, this has been going on for quite a long time. We've always talked about these issues. And if you look at the record, only the Indian delegation has ever brought in professionals, economists, environmentalists in these delegations. The Chinese side has always brought in politicos, people from their think tanks who give this ideological spiel and talk about cooperation, but from a very strongly ideological or political approach. So, for example, one Chinese scholar who was in my session, he talked about scientific and technological cooperation and progress and saying that this was not the prerogative or hegemony of developed countries, right? And he specifically highlighted China's contributions to help goods to global markets, to lower prices, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, he also talked about regional cooperation or organizations such as the SCO, saying that this was not an alliance, and that the SCO was a forum for solving problems. And specifically, again, I mean, if he had just stopped at that, it would be fine. But again, he comes and tries to compare it with NATO, saying that NATO needs to create enemies, while the SCO is all about trust and cooperation. Now, I mean, if you look at the record again, the fact is that the SCO also doesn't do too much. And if India, while it is a member of the SCO and so on, the fact of the matter is there are very strong differences in approaches to key issues such as terrorism and so on. Similarly, SCO, BRICS, RIC, none of these organizations have been capable of coming to a consensus on the reform for actual steps to implement reforms in global systems, global institutions. There is lip service paid, but there is no response on how that has to be done. Now, the Chinese, of course, when you come to the Chinese agenda, of course, they brought in addition to what I just said, they were talking up their talking points, Community of Global Destiny, the BRI, the 3 global initiatives. And of course, they attempted to reach out to India or I mean, remember that this is, of course, just before the new petroleum agreement is announced. I think they wanted to reach out to the Indian side to promote the idea of cooperation. But even so, they did not fail to hint at or comment directly about their concerns with India. Again, like I said, they seem to think that India had thrown its lot in with the Americans. Once again proving that they just cannot look at India as an independent actor, that they have to sort of put it in some camp or the other if they find the Indians are not acting according to what the Chinese would like them to act. So, but in typical Chinese fashion, accusation is followed by suggestions for cooperation. And there were very strong demands, easier visa access for Chinese citizens, resumption of direct flights, resumption of student exchanges, resumption of journalists, journalists returning to both countries, and so on and so forth. And several what the Chinese call low-hanging fruit, young scholars forum, bilateral cooperation in AI, all this green technology. I mean, all of this is talk, but from experience, we know that none of this will actually happen, except maybe these education exchanges or forums where there is very little that they actually have to do. So, if I were to put my big point out there, I would say that the Russians were pushing Chinese talking points, and the Chinese were fairly confident that the Russians would do so. Now, in my presentation, and you get a sense of what the others were saying when you hear what I said, because I was also responding to what the Chinese and the Russians were saying. I was very clear that there were at least 4 different problems in the RIC. There was difficulties in individual bilateral relations, that the RIC was second, the RIC was affected by regional complexities and flux. And third, the RIC, the organizations that RIC members were associated with, like I said, the SCO were just weak or limited in their scope or activities. So that's why they can say that, well, we are better off than the NATO, but your set of activities that you engage in itself seems very limited, or is about not ruffling any feathers. Fourth, the global environment itself is against the idea of the RIC. It's not enough for simply the 3 countries to actually stand up and talk, but since they are not able to work together, there is a problem that the rest of the world does not take RIC too seriously, or that there are very easy ways of saying that the RIC is problematic or anti-West. So from the Indian point of view, clearly we cannot have an anti-West, anti-democratic outlook in the RIC, which is exactly the outlook of the 2 other members. There is no common economic action plan. Unilateral development plans by one country or the other are not actually brought to the RIC. So, and plus, of course, one member of the RIC tends, or members of the RIC tend to promote civilizational narratives that are exclusionary in nature. So, and so this is no way to go forward, at least as far as RIC is concerned. And none of these questions actually elicited responses from the RIC. And I think that is really the weakness of the RIC as well. Thank you.
Right. So here we have the healthy skeptic coming in. Yeah, I think I will definitely endorse two points that Jabin made. One was that this was certainly a huge push on the part of the Russians, and had they not really, in fact, there were they tried to get this going in February this year, but new dynamics in the Ukraine war. They had to push it. Then they tried to have it in June. Again, there were some issues that cropped up, but they certainly did not give up and really gave a huge push to bringing this together. The fact that it was coming together after a gap of the pandemic and, of course, the Sino-Indian kind of tensions underscores, therefore, the Russian understanding very clearly that if the RIC has to go anywhere, the bilaterals have to be addressed. Otherwise, unless we are seen to be cooperating with each other, how do we become a legitimate kind of a framework to? So these are two things which came out very clearly from the Russian side. On the Chinese side, the bilateral was, and I'll come in the end when I give you a sense of the session on bilateral dynamics. But clearly, everybody came round to this point that how do we address the bilaterals within the time? And there, it was all about India-China. Other bilaterals are really fairly good going. Arvind, Jabin, you have included General Narasimhan's points in the...
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Okay. Arvind, your turn. You too were talking about functional cooperation and some newer areas.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. And hello to everyone. This was my second and third time to be at the RIC forum, and Jabin comes from the latter part of the category who believes or have a bit of doubt over the pump functions and the efficiency of RIC. I come from the first because of two basic reasons. One, I try to look at the possible areas where all three parties can sit down and talk. Practically, it doesn't look like all these three parties are sitting and talking independent of politics and independent of strategic matters. So as a result of it, the actual cooperations have been stalled on many fronts. All three countries are trading very well, but when it comes to investments, when it comes to structural or adjusting, accepting the structural changes of working towards each other, it doesn't seem like taking place. I was part of a session which was more of a new energy or hydrocarbon, and this was put forward by the Russian side that I have to speak on the hydrocarbons or alternatives to hydrocarbons. And my larger points were around how much of in past 25 years these three countries have cooperated in the sector of hydrocarbons plus the transition towards the new energy. And then the figures are absolutely doubting the efforts initiated by these three countries. So some of my broad points when I spoke about what is most important for all these three countries is not only about looking at the mechanisms, but also trying to find out or trying to find three important benchmarkings as far as the energy transitions are concerned. And three energy transition benchmarking were involved. One is the availability of energy or the hydrocarbons, and then the non-hydrocarbons or the new energy. Second one is the accessibility, and the third one is the affordability. And if you take these three benchmarking or the three factors at the center, you will understand that both China and Russia have a strong relationship when it comes to trading of hydrocarbons or trading of the fossil fuel or biomass energy. But apart from that, they haven't even succeeded too much to pursue the alternative energy scenarios. There are many reasons Chinese do want to get into the Russian market, but it is not possible, or maybe somewhere the Russians are not ready to do it. There are couple of important reasons, why Russians want to speak about the new energy, so that they can fit into the program of sustainable development. They can fit into the programs called, alternative energies. But a major problem for Russia is actually the entire transition of its local industries and the national industries, whether they are ready to transfer from, or to have been able to do the transition from the hydrocarbons to the non-hydrocarbon industry sources. So understanding that, China knows that there are certain level of limitations to it. One more thing very important, both Russia and China are part of New Development Bank. Both Russia and China have been talking very loud and explicitly about new energy cooperations. For the matter of fact, it is only recently in 2024 August in Cape Town, in his annual meeting, NDB passed about 3 billion USD for the new energy projects. This was the first time any fundamental commitment has been made by a financial institution where both Russia and China are part of. And it looks like yes, as a kind of propaganda, both these countries want to push the agenda of alternative energy, but both are not ready actually, or not maybe reflecting it when it comes to actual funding. So that is one thing. Second important thing, if you look at the definition of innovation, certainly China is far ahead, when it comes to investments in innovations are concerned, and to have the smooth transition to new energy, which Russia keeps talking about, which China keeps talking about, so India keeps on talking about. If you want to bring or achieve the level of net zero emissions by 2070, India needs to invest approximately 160 billion US dollars per year, and that looks absolutely out of practical things. As a result of it, if you remember, India had proposed in the G20 summit the multiple energy pathways, MEP, and I think that's where China started falling in line. China started talking about it. But when it comes to practicality, again, China has never been a part. China never agreed to India's solar cooperation. China never agreed to some of the proposals India put forward to cut emissions. So what is innovation has been defined and standardized by all these three countries in different forms. I'll give you one example over here. When it comes to Russia, the innovation is understood to diversifying the storage capacities, efficiencies in storage capacities, transmission of the old hydrocarbons. But they do not talk explicitly about the new energies, though the project which talks about how Russia has to be efficiently deal with that has been spoken about. But overall, there has to be no cooperation on the ground. That's something very important. One of the important takeaways which I thought, there is new energy has been correlated with the new materials when it comes to Russia and China. The China and Russia are very keen on cooperating as far as the new area and or new market for exporting the rare earth metals and minerals. And both these countries are working closely to exploit these resources in their favor to export it to the other markets. But this is not really happening within RIC. Though RIC countries, in Russia and China talking about, let's have India on board and talk talk about new energy initiatives, that is not really functioning. And if you look at the present dynamics, where Russia is actually earning maximum of its forex by selling its hydrocarbons, fossil fuels to China and India, it looks like, you know, the new energy, new metal, new material discussion between RIC is not actually finding any traction between the three countries. When it comes to oil, I mean, let's have a cooperation in the matter of oil. There is something interesting happening among these three countries. India has been risingly investing into the Russian oil. Russia has been selling it to India and to use it as one of the ways to detour the sanctions, Western sanctions. And India has become one of the important, you know, pit point for the Russian energy market. But at the same time, when it comes to the pricing and when it comes to the other factors of this impact of the energy market, the two important thing one has to understand it, and I think it has come out quite clearly in the discussion, but those were not taken forward. The first thing is about the oil production and oil consumption triangle between these three countries. If both China and India are buying maximum of its fossil fuel or energy from Russia, they are not actually climbing closer to, you know, make a club, you know, which will decide or which will influence the larger energy prices globally. I mean, that is not happening. So what it looks like, these three countries are talking together on energy, but that's something, you know, on a short-term basis, on a band-aid fashion, you know, nothing substantial happening between three countries. You remember there was in 2018, both China and India were talking about oil buyers club, oil buyers cartel. And we are 6 years on, nothing has happened. And after the Ukraine crisis, I think nobody's speaking about it. I think that is something which is being lying over there. Joint working group, again, which was talked about by the Indian government in 2019 to some kind of, you know, settle or decide, you know, how this energy cooperation can go quite influentially, has not been even taken into consideration in the RIC format. So when it comes to functionality of this thing, slowly, we're moving from 1.5 track to 2 track to 2.5 track, you know, slowly being moved out of it. A third important thing, which is, I think, partly Professor Chinoy and Javin has also mentioned it. Interestingly, what is happening, the triangle of oil production and oil consumption between Russia, India, and China is creating a new kind of instability within this triangle. India has been buying too much of the Russian oil without having any substantial currency swap agreements or the bilateral agreements, you know, how that local currency will be settled in. And then you see China finding an opportunity to emerge as one of the point wherein the money can be processed or yuan can be used as a mode of, you know, settlement between these three countries. So nobody thought that, you know, how China would come into and actually you know, exploit benefits, which is, or maybe the best coupling happening between these three countries in its favor. And the last point, which is very important, you know, if you start looking at the energy investments which are happening between these three countries, and whether those energy investments, the new energy investments happening between these three countries, are going to take these RIC towards the new energy. And at present, it looks we are far from the reality, because as far as the energy transition goals are concerned, China does not look cooperation opportunities with Russia and India. With India for political reasons and for Russia for all purely economic reasons. As a result of it, that energy transition, China putting something and, you know, helping this RIC take forward doesn't look practical. It is not looking, it will end into something proper. Second thing, we haven't seen Chinese banks showing interest to raise their stakes in new energy innovation projects in India and Russia. India is, of course, we can understand the logic behind it, but in Russia also, you do not see Chinese labs, Chinese tier one institutions putting in money investments into creating top-notch research capacities. We haven't seen Tsinghua coming up. We haven't seen some of the top companies coming from Shenzhen and Shanghai doing it. So I think that's where the China's claim of building non-hydrocarbon triangular or the new energy triangular between RIC countries looks super flawed. My last point, I think I made this point in one of my reports which are submitted to the team, away from the solutions to the hydrocarbons, slowly moving to the new energies, slowly moving to new metals. The Chinese and Russians have been talking aloud about that RIC should have technological sovereignty and RIC should work on AI. But my fundamental question has been always, if RIC countries or partners are not believing in each other, and if trying to look at only the transactional results and the fruits, I don't think any kind of a technological sovereignty will happen between the RIC countries. I'm optimistic over here, but I'm just trying to underline the present problems over here. I think I stop there, ma'am. Thank you.
Thanks, Arvind. I think between all the presentations, we have managed to get a fair idea of this spirit of the RIC in terms of, or within the context of this academic exercise, that it combines the best of academic or let's say moving away from the diplomatic calculations or pressures and free to, in one sense, explore realms on the one hand, and then having to face the realities of international politics in terms of interests and how principles get jettisoned and how the fundamental nature of relationships gets completely influenced, affected by the contemporary dynamics. So that we have here all the possibilities that scholars can talk about and yet look at the realities. So between the possibilities and the realities, really, the RIC is taking this dialogue along. Now, I'm going to spend just about 3 or 4 minutes quickly to give you a sense of the session on the bilateral discussions on the bilateral relationships, and then we can open this up for Q&A. So I'll again start from the fact that the Russians pushed this idea of the holding the offline RIC after this gap, largely because they believe that strategic understanding on which the RIC can make any kind of a difference or can move towards the goals that they have outlined cannot be brought about unless we have the bilateral arms, as it were, sorted out. That and remember, the Russians, and this has been mentioned a bit, that the Russians do believe that the RIC is really the core, the very core of any kind of emerging order. The RIC is the core of the BRICS. The BRICS has now obviously morphed out into a life of its own. It fathered the SCO, and that this the new initiatives that are coming out of this RIC core and the BRICS and the SCO and all other things will eventually become the foundations for or become the core, a pillar, as it were, on which this process of restructuring can be envisaged. Now, if all this great idea is there, then clearly, if it is standing on foundations of sand, then it cannot work out. And that's really where the Russians were pushing, that how do we impart strategic stability to this RIC core? And once more again on where the Russians were driving at when they were pushing for improving bilateral dynamics, I think two broad areas where both, and Jabin has brought this out, where both the Russians and the Chinese seem to converge. Two broad areas which they want this new dynamo to move in towards is a new financial architecture on the one hand, and a new security, much more uh, uh, much more Asia-centric security architecture, which can tackle some of the issues. And here, again, the Russians and the Chinese were on the same side when they were talking about, say, the Indo-Pacific developments or the Quad and such like, where they felt that the intrusion by the Western powers were directed against precisely undermining these kinds of objectives. Now, given this perspective from which the Russians were coming, broadly, I think the three sides had two different approaches to the bilateral question. I think one approach was, which again seemed to be accepted by all, that nobody can sort out anybody's bilateral problems. In other words, China, and although the Russians did try to put in their example of their own sorting out with China, but that, and in fact, the leader of the Russian delegation, Kirill Babayev, he said, look, we will not push China and India towards any kind of a resolution, but can the Russian example help? And can the trilateral dynamics actually exert a positive kind of a role as far as bilateral issues are concerned, that you see some greater issues and you see the potential and possibilities. So, so we won't do anything, but can we play an honest broker's role? I mean, they veered. So different Russian scholars were taking different tacks. Can we play an honest broker's role? Of course, we don't want to interfere in the other. So this was roughly the situation. And the Chinese seem to be suggesting both, that yes, the bilateral problems between India and China are the problem. Of course, given that they were track 1.5, the problem was all on the Indian side, that Indians are objecting to this or blocking this or stuff like that. And yet they were also saying that we should not be getting bilateral issues into the trilateral, and that should be kept separate. So these were two, I thought, rather paradoxical kind of positions that seem to intervene into this debate on the bilateral issues. Broadly, I will just mention 3 points that I made in my presentation, which were in one sense echoed in all the presentations from different points of view. That number one, that the contentious issues between countries, and particularly here India and China, basically has also been exacerbated by the developments over the last decade and a half, where the power asymmetry between the three has emerged in a way that is further exerting pressure on the bilateral relationships. And that, so while the power asymmetry is exerting its own pressure, regional dynamics are then playing out in a way in which these asymmetries are getting further exacerbated. And clearly, even where regional issues were concerned, there was not much meeting of ground between China and India. The second thing that came about was that can we talk about the bilaterals within this trilateral without really bringing in the American or the role of the United States, because each of these three countries, now, whether we go back to the time when Biden was there or the overhang of, oh, what if Trump, and now actually Trump, the fact remains that there is now a clear understanding, which is very different, that each of these three countries has with the United States. So, in other words, the trilateral debate has to also appreciate or bring on board the relationship of all these three countries with the US, and to understand that these are not exclusive kind of partnerships, that though there are, so okay, let me rephrase that though there are ups and downs in the bilateral dynamics between China, India, and Russia, and the US on the other hand, we cannot really overstate either the divergences or the convergences, that these are evolving relationships, and it is coming at a time when the entire international system is under stress. So, in addition to other things, we saw that there was this additional factor. Finally, I think the interesting thing is that all the three, different participants in all the three countries, they come up with this. So everybody's trying to bring in this civilizational dimension into the bilateral dynamics in very different ways. But the fact that each of them believed that this was a landmass and this were peoples who had contributed to the evolution of human civilization should make it incumbent on us to find more creative ways to address problems of contemporary international relations, that we do subscribe to a sense of a non-Western approach as well, which should help us find out different ways to address our problems. So this was the idealistic part, if you will, but this was also a part which came out very strongly. And yeah, that was it. I think I'll stop there and see if there are questions or comments or any kind of discussions. Yeah, so are there any questions in the chat box? No questions in the chat box, but if there are, seems to be like a huge, oh, Ravi's raised his hand. All right. It seemed like people were still trying to digest what they had heard. Yes, Ravi, please just come up and speak. Yeah.
Hi. Hello. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for a very interesting session. And it certainly poses what I would call behavioral challenges, if you look at it from a process angle. So this is what I want to address, that clearly some value, I don't know how much value, some value is seen in RIC, even by the skeptics. Otherwise, it wouldn't continue. And I suppose the logic there is it's better to attend a forum where not everyone agrees with everyone else all the time. That's also important to keep that dialogue going. But I was wondering whether, since RIC is a forum for academics, perhaps the agenda can be expanded to look at such process elements rather than only confine yourself to subject agendas. Let me give you an example. In many business meetings, the meetings are conducted with time kept for a process analysis at the end. For example, a meeting always has an agenda and subjects that have to be discussed, decisions taken, etc. At the end of the meeting, the process review, what the process review does is look at how the meeting was conducted, not just going by a tick box of the decisions. Was there equity in participation amongst all? Did someone hog the limelight or hog the time, preventing others? What was the conduct of each part of the session by the chairman? Were suggestions taken by some participants discussed and taken up collaboratively, or was it all compartmentalized? There are many other axes of process analysis that can be developed. I'm suggesting this because the advantage of an academic conference is that you can innovate this kind of thing rather than stick to the same format as track one would involve. For example, one thing that can be done is what has RIC done? What has it achieved? What are its achievements over this 25-year period? 25 years would be a very good kind of landmark to do this kind of thing. And let academics who reputedly would have the independence of mind not always to parrot their own national position 100% all the time, but give themselves some leeway, would be able to come up with some creative methods. Just a suggestion. I don't know whether what I've said is clear.
No, it's absolutely clear. I'll just leave it open. I mean, anybody who wants to come in and react, respond, or say something else, feel free, just raise your hand and come in.
Yeah.
But yes,
Right.
Ravi, I think that's okay. Devin, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bothlingam, for that question. I think that's a very important question. And that's a question particularly germane to the RIC Academic Trilateral Forum, at least in the way that it has been run from India. Like I said, one of the reasons for my skepticism of this agenda is, as you said, and how does this process unfold? I mean, and you said, for example, is there somebody who hogs the agenda? Now, part of the reason why agendas are hogged is a power dynamic in the room, right? There is a CEO or there is a superior officer and there are juniors in the room. And now the fact of the matter is the Indian side is always in the room, one hand behind its back, because we are a purely academic side, whereas the other guys are track 1.5 or representatives of their government. So it's not really a purely academic forum, because ultimately you have to remember that the Chinese academics are agents of the state. And one has to increasingly face this question or this reality head on, because unlike maybe 10 years ago, where Chinese academics still spoke somewhat freely, were receptive to counters, today they are pushing back almost aggressively, as if they have to put in that point and therefore move ahead. So the other question, I mean, another important or interesting question that you raise is, does the RIC address issues in silos, or does it address them collectively? I would argue that when it comes to issues for cooperation, these are addressed in silos. So we have the science and tech agenda, or a session on science and tech cooperation. But as Arvind pointed out, there's a lot of talk, but there's never any follow-up, precisely because that's the reality. I mean, the Chinese are really not interested, at least in this particular case, because the Chinese are leaders in these matters. They are not interested. They don't see advantage in following it up unless there is a market opening process, right? But when it comes to the ideological agenda, the anti-West agenda, those come collectively. Those inform every single session that you have, whether it's about financial architecture, whether it's about science and tech, whether it's about regional organizations, that's always there. So I think it's useful to sort of, I mean, certainly from our side, it's useful to look at it from this agenda. And I pointed out before that unlike the Chinese side, and I mean, I would say also the Russian side, we are the only team that has ever brought in professionals in some of these areas that we are themes that we are discussing. I can't recall, at least in the few instances that I've been part of RIC meetings, that they have ever brought in somebody. Usually, it's a junior researcher or a scholar who comes in with these so-called, all milk and honey issues of scientific cooperation. But they do not actually exercise or have any expertise. And none of these green tech issues have ever been followed up. I mean, you see that also in the formal government to government meeting. They are always on the agenda, but none of it has any follow-up. But thank you for that question and that approach.
Anu, you want to come in? No. Unmute. Unmute, Anu, please.
Yeah, I just thought Yasin had raised his hand. So, no, what I'm saying is to Jabin is that one thing is that, I mean, it's not just these two who are have this civilizational approach, because even while we didn't have it from the Indian side in RIC, overall India now has this kind of civilizational approach also in their own kind of how they're seeing Indian or Hindu civilization, which they're putting forward in various documents. That's one. So, and I agree that these are all exclusionary, but it's not that India doesn't have it. That's one. Second is that it's not just, for example, I haven't been to other RICs earlier, and nor have I followed who went and what happened. But for example, this time, General Narasimhan is not exactly an academic. He's very much a practitioner in the know of things. And I thought his being there was very useful, as were some of the earlier diplomats who were part of the RIC, who could cross between track 2, track 1.5, and even track 1. Given their kind of positions. So there is this fluidity between the three. So I think it's important to keep these kind of things, very important to keep these kind of things going. But one thing which was not raised was the fact that both Russia and the Chinese, I noticed, were quite, they were very interested in the advancing the Eurasian Economic Forum. And now I notice when Mr. Putin comes in January, India might just have, it's in the process of developing a free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic group in Russia. So I don't know if it'll come through, but there was some talk about it. So that's interesting, the fact that it came up in the RIC, and now I see it in some of the little bits which are coming out when there's a talk about this upcoming meeting between our Prime Minister and that Russian president. So that's another kind of area, because they were talking about a Eurasian security architecture, which I don't think India would ever get linked with. Yeah, but the economic architecture, I think there might be some interest because India will get an access not only to Russia, but to Kazakhstan and various other Central Asian. So that's another part which we didn't talk about.
When the sorry, you could carry on. You didn't
That's it. That's
Okay,
it.
no, just before I get to Yasin, I just wanted to take up what you said earlier about how there has been an element of track 1.5, that is to say, retired practitioners who've always been part of the RIC. But yes, this is, in fact, the Russians at one point, and this goes back to maybe the 12th or 13th RIC, the Russians actually remarked upon the necessity of making their delegations as functionally specialized as the Indian. So that was acknowledged. But the fact remains that this is again a reflection of this close synergy between 1.5, and 2. That one reason that while the government supported the idea of the ICS participating in this 19th trilateral, the hesitation to bring or to for the retired practitioners also was partly because of the track 1 scenario not being quite so for instance there was a lot of pressure, and we had a meeting with the minister of foreign affairs, Russian foreign minister, and the one point agenda that he had was that track 1 RIC should get started at the earliest, and that scholars should push for this. So clearly, at this point, maybe track 1 is not yet on the cards as far as India is concerned. So that's another. So yes, we have, I won't put it as one hand tied behind our back, but yes, we are to some extent on the back foot, if you will, if you want to put the back imagery, in terms of the extent to which we can take the statist narrative or even push for what the state says. But yeah, Yasin, you want to come in? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. So I'm Muhammad Yasin. I submitted my PhD thesis and going to have my PhD viva in a week, hopefully. So this is a very interesting discussion, and I have a quick question for either Professor Chennai or Dr. Jacob, or maybe both. So Professor Chennai mentioned that one of the 3 positions of the RIC, and actually what she mentioned, that bilateral relations should not be a back burner while trying to find common grounds. And then Dr. Jacob highlighted that Russian side cited Sino-Soviet mitigation mechanism while trying to encourage India and China to iron out the wrinkles in the bilateral relations, or particularly the transgression issue. So in the similar context, how does Russia perceives India's bid for its UNSC membership, and if and how it suggests anything to China on India's application, or in the broader sense on the reforms of the UNSC? Thank you.
Yeah, who will take it up?
Jabin, you go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, Yasin, well, congratulations on submitting the PhD, and very glad to hear that the Viva is around the corner. So good luck with that. And I understand that your PhD itself is on China's participation in the UN. So this was a question that frankly we have raised several times about India's UNSC permanent membership, but I think we've gotten to the point that we just have given up. We are no longer raising it at the RIC because we know that nothing will come of it. I mean, the Russians will obviously always say, yes, we want India as part of it. But as long as the Chinese are opposed to it, and the Chinese will keep coming up with spurious reasons, one after the other, for objecting to India's membership. So that's just the way it is right now. So there's no forward movement on that. I think we've pretty much given up on that hope, even in an academic trilateral forum.
Yeah, okay.
Can I make one more remark?
Yeah, of course, Ravi. Please do come in.
No, another thought strikes me that, you see, the government has encouraged RIC in a sort of lukewarm way, with as maybe a summary of what all of you have said. partly because I think the government will be very embarrassed to discontinue the academic trilateral, which has a very long history, and with uh, relationship with Russia at least being good. It will be very embarrassing. So it's a kind of it's like a stepmother or stepfather kind of relationship with the academic trilateral. But there are advantages to having a stepmother or stepfather, because they can always be kicked downstairs if you don't like them. You can't do that with anyone else. So the advantages of having multiple channels are that you can use one to do things which the other can disavow, and vice versa. But the full power of the system, I feel, is not being used. So really, internally, we should have a chat with our own folk that, look, you have a academic trilateral in whatsoever form, and others are not, as Javin has pointed out, dyed-in-the-wool academics. There are various hues and shapes. But the whole synergy of this is being lost because of the perceived position. And many times academics perceive that they have to be kind of shadow ambassadors in a way, self-paint themselves into those colors. So they also sometimes voluntarily give up the power of this multiple channel approach. I think the US probably does a better job of the academic discussions with the Chinese and the others, along with the official ones that we do. If you just compare it.
I would certainly go along with that because, one of the things that I felt is that between track 1 and track 2, track 1 is not really very proactive in using track 1. Even if, say, for trial balloons or some kind, put out some kind of a narrative out there and generate a dialogue and generate some kind of a discussion. Most of the time, I think academics, particularly when we look at those who are dealing with Russia or China, tend to broadly fall into two kind of groupings. And I don't know whether that is generating better discussions or not. But anyway, that's the...
Can I just quickly come in on this? I think, well, we have to remember two things. There is no government support in material terms to the ICCA for the RIC. It's not lukewarm. There is non-existent support materially. So this forum could very well shut down because the ICCA doesn't have the means to continue with this. That's one. Second, the government does engage with the Russians and does support Indian participants attending, for example, the Volatile Forum in Russia, which is an exclusively Russia organized event. On China, the government, of course, prefers to keep its own channels. It is not, again, I don't think, historically, the government has been very reluctant to let anybody else within the Indian system into discussions with the Chinese, except for very, very brief periods of time, I think. So I think we have to sort of remember that fact as well, that there is a separate channel for the Russians, there's a separate channel for the Chinese. It's not as if the government is not engaging with either side. And so, frankly, I think the way things are structured in our country, there's very, very little use that the government makes, as you said, makes use of academics. It's just not the way things are done here, unfortunately. Though, as you pointed out, Mr. Budlingam, there are so many different ways in which it can be done. That's just the way things are here. And so, yes, I agree. The Americans are far smarter about these things than we have been.
All right. I think we've come to the end of our time. Arvind, you would like to come in with any summing up kind of assessments on the discussion? Hello, Arvind, are you around? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
No, I was just wondering if you had any kind of concluding comments. That goes for all the participants here. If there is any summing up that you would like to do about what we've just.
No, the couple of two important points which are important, which I want to reflect upon. Number one is we have been looking at the change and the makeover of RIC format, as you had given the reference of, Ambassador, in the first ever RIC talking about the importance of it, and the government, the Indian government establishment not taking this forward, formally in track one. What I see, I think, is taking forward, as an academician or maybe think tankers. We have a background of that, and ICCA being, one of the organizing institutions. I would rather want to underline two things: that the format of the RIC is whatever it is still fine, but it has to come up with some kind of a deliverable every year. So when the last RIC gets over until the next RIC, there has to be some deliverable has to come out, because academicians and being a think tanker or coming from think tank background, we should not stop and give away to the pressures and not be neglected by the establishment. We have our own genome structure different from these people. That's number one. And second thing is, how are we going to look at, because the entire imbalance within the tripod, as Kirill Babayev, the director of that institute, said that this is the most stable one. But I think the stable structures also have the asymmetries. Okay, these asymmetries making them look stable is, I think, that's a flaw. But there is inherent instability in the structure, and it looks like this political angle to RIC is going to keep that inherent asymmetry be there for another 10-15 years. So we have to be very careful about this asymmetry getting not in favor of us. I mean, we have to, and as Jabin said correctly, since the first forum until this forum, it is only the Indian academicians and the team who bring the most critical point to the table. We are the one who criticize we have been critical to three sides. We have been critical to Russia, we have been critical to China, and we have been critical to self also. I think this has not been the case with the Chinese and Russians. And despite knowing that, we've been participating and we've been putting forth our point. I think that is somewhere, going back to Ravi sir's point, the skepticism is also has a silver, line that, that's why we keep on investing to it. And that's the reason, I think, for all good reasons, we think that we have a better chances to rather make the RIC format work efficiently and continue engaging it. We know that, we have these three sides to deal with. Actually, it's a 4 sides within RIC we discussed. Yeah, that's what I want to conclude.
Yeah. Thanks. No, I like that point, that we have been, uniformly critical of everybody, including ourselves. And I think that gives us greater self-reflexive capabilities. So that's good. Anybody? Anu, Jabin? All right, so we have actually come to the end of the time as well. So I'll just conclude by saying 2 things. Number one, Ravi, I'll go back to your point about the, what was it? The process review. And I think, yes, it's high time that 25 years of the RIC idea, conference, outcomes, these have to be very critically assessed. And yeah, maybe the ICCA is best positioned to bring a volume out on this. The Chinese won't bring it, but I think we could. Incidentally, Sergei Uyanayev, who was a part of the Russian delegation, has already published a book about 5 years ago on the RIC experience. Unfortunately, it's in Russian. And I tried to find out what are the costs, and it's horrible, the translation from Russian into English, but okay, so there's something which already has been done by the Russian side. Now I think we need to bring that out, number one. Number two, from the time that this has begun, I've been part of it. I'm invested in it to the extent that I still believe that this platform has the capacity to generate ideas. That there are two elements. There is one which belongs to the realm of ideas, which belongs to the realm of actually conceptualizing futures that come out of the civilizational heritages of these three countries. There is a real political dimension which we need to be aware of. We are aware of that, and we operate within the boundaries of that real politic. But between the ideal politic and the real politic, I think the ICS is carving its own space. I think I will stop there. Thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
With this, we
yes,
come to the
yes, Ritika, I formally request you to wind up. Thank you.
With this, we come to the end of today's discussion. We thank Professor Acharya and the esteemed panelists, Professor Anuradha Chinnoy, Dr. Jabin T. Jacob, and Dr. Aravind Yellary, for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. The video of today's discussion shall be available on the ICCA's YouTube channel. We would like to invite you to the upcoming Wednesday seminar scheduled for 11 December 2024. Further information regarding the event can be found on the ICCA's website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, Ritika. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.